Imagine cleaning out an old barn and finding a stack of rusty cast iron pans buried beneath years of dust, hay, and junk. You might look at them and think, those are worthless. You might even throw them into a scrap pile. But what if one of those ugly, rust-covered pans was worth hundreds of dollars? What if another was worth over 1,000? And what if the most valuable one had been sitting unnoticed in that barn for generations? That is exactly why old cast iron deserves a second look. Because when it comes to antique cookware, rust does not necessarily mean worthless. Sometimes, the uglier the pan looks, the more interesting its history becomes. Today, we're counting down 10 rusty cast iron pans that could be hiding in an old American barn. And more importantly, we're going to show you the details collectors look for. And stay with me until number 1. Because the most valuable pans aren't always the ones that look the oldest. In fact, sometimes the smallest marking can completely change what a pan is worth. Let's start with one that many people would probably overlook. The first pan is the kind you might find sitting on a wooden shelf in an old farmhouse kitchen. It's heavy, it's dark, and after decades of use, its surface may be covered in layers of seasoning, grime, and rust. At first glance, there doesn't appear to be anything special about it, but that's precisely the point. Old cast iron was built to last. Unlike thin modern cookware, these pans were designed to survive years of cooking over wood-burning stoves, open fires, and kitchen ranges. The first thing you want to look for is the marking on the bottom. Turn the pan over. Don't just look at the cooking surface. Look underneath. You'll want to check for a manufacturer's name, logo, number, letters, or unusual symbols. Even a small marking can help establish when and where the pan was made. And here's something important. Don't aggressively remove the rust before identifying the pan. That rust might be covering information that could help determine its age. But number 10 is only the beginning. Because the next pan has a feature that can make collectors much more interested. Imagine finding a cast iron skillet with almost nothing visible on the cooking surface. It looks ordinary, but underneath, there's a strange symbol or set of letters. You clean away just enough dirt to reveal it. Suddenly, you have a clue. This is where identifying antique cast iron becomes almost like detective work. Collectors examine the shape of the handle, the design of the underside, the size, the casting texture, the location of markings. Even the way the manufacturer formed the pan can provide clues. And that's why two pans that look almost identical can have completely different values. One could be a common piece that sells for a modest amount. The other could be a scarce variation that collectors actively search for. But don't make the mistake of thinking every old pan with a strange marking is automatically valuable. Condition, rarity, authenticity, and demand all matter. Now let's move to number 8. Here's another clue people often ignore. Weight. Pick up an old cast iron pan. Some feel surprisingly heavy for their size. That's because traditional cast iron cookware was often thick and heavily constructed. But weight alone doesn't make a pan valuable. What matters is the combination of weight, shape, construction, and identifying characteristics. Look at the handle. Is there a hole at the end? Is the handle unusually shaped? Does it have a raised ridge? Does the underside have distinctive patterns? Are there letters or numbers cast directly into the iron? These details can help separate an ordinary old skillet from something more collectible. And here's where things get interesting. Sometimes collectors aren't looking for a perfect pan. They're looking for a particular version of a pan. A slight difference in a mold can turn an ordinary-looking piece into a variation that somebody has been searching for. And we're getting closer to the pans where the real money can begin. Not every valuable piece of old cast iron is a frying pan. Sometimes it's a griddle. And old griddles can be incredibly easy to overlook. You might find one leaning against a wall in a barn. Maybe it has been used as a shelf. Maybe someone put tools on it. Maybe it has been sitting there so long that nobody even remembers what it was originally used for. But before you throw it away, flip it over. Look carefully at the underside. The manufacturer's markings may tell you far more than the rusty surface. Also examine the cooking surface. Is it completely flat? Does it have unusual edges? Are there raised markings? Is the casting unusually smooth? Every one of those details can help identify the piece. And here's the surprising part. Sometimes the value isn't simply in the age. A pan doesn't become valuable just because it's old. It becomes interesting when age meets rarity, history, condition, and collector demand. That's the distinction you need to remember. Because number 6 takes us into an entirely different category. Picture an old skillet sitting inside a farmhouse barn. Maybe it came from a family kitchen decades ago. Maybe it was passed down from a grandmother. Maybe it traveled across the country with a family that eventually settled on a farm. The pan itself may not look spectacular, but its history can make it fascinating. This is one reason old farm buildings can be such treasure troves. Barns weren't museums. People used them. They stored tools there. They stored cookware. They kept equipment that had stopped being useful, but wasn't quite worth throwing away. And sometimes those objects survived simply because nobody bothered to get rid of them. That's why an old barn can contain things that have effectively disappeared from everyday life. But don't get too excited yet. We're only halfway through the list. And the next 4 pans are where you really need to start paying attention. Because some collectors aren't simply looking for old cast iron. They're looking for specific manufacturers, specific patterns, and specific production variations. And one tiny detail can make all the difference. But before you start digging through your own barn, remember this. If you find an old cast iron pan, don't immediately sandblast it, grind it, repaint it, or throw it into a fire. First, identify it, because you never know what is hiding underneath that rust. And in part 2, we're moving into the pans that can become considerably more interesting to collectors. Number 4 has a feature many people completely miss. Number 2 is the kind of discovery that could make someone stop cleaning the barn altogether. And number 1? That's the pan you absolutely don't want to mistake for scrap. Welcome back. We've already seen why an ordinary-looking skillet can deserve a second look. But now we're entering the part of the list where identification becomes even more important. Because once you get into rarer examples, the difference between an ordinary pan and a collectible one can sometimes be surprisingly small. Take a close look at an old skillet. Now look at its surface. Is the casting smooth? Or does it have a rough, almost pebbled appearance? Look underneath. Are there unusual lines? Raised numbers? Letters? A logo? A heat ring? These aren't just random imperfections. They can be clues. Old manufacturers change their molds and production methods over time. And those changes can help collectors determine approximately when a piece was made and which version it represents. This is why experienced collectors don't simply glance at a pan and say, "It's old." They examine it. They compare it. They look for characteristics that match known examples. And that's something you can do too. If you discover an old skillet, photograph the front, back, handle, and every visible marking before doing anything to it. That information can help you research the piece without destroying its original surface. But number 4 is where the story gets even more interesting. Here's something else people overlook. Size. Most people naturally think about the standard skillet sizes they grew up seeing. But unusual sizes can sometimes attract collectors. A very small pan, an unusually large skillet, a specialized cooking vessel. A piece designed for a particular purpose. These unusual examples can be more interesting because fewer of them may have survived. Imagine finding an enormous cast iron pan buried behind an old barn. You might assume it was simply made for a large family. But what if it was designed for commercial cooking? What if it was used in a restaurant, camp kitchen, hotel, railroad kitchen, or large farm operation? Suddenly, the story changes. And that's the lesson. Never judge old cast iron only by appearance. Look for the clues, because sometimes the strange piece is the one worth researching. Now we're getting serious. A manufacturer's marking can be one of the most important things to find. Some old cast iron pieces are heavily marked. Others have surprisingly little information. And sometimes the marking is hidden underneath decades of buildup. That's why you should turn the pan upside down. Look around the center. Check near the handle. Examine the outer edge. And don't ignore numbers. A number may refer to a size rather than a year. A letter might identify a mold or production variation. A symbol could point toward a particular manufacturer. But here's where you need to be careful. Don't assume a mysterious marking automatically means thousands of dollars. Online listings can show wildly inflated asking prices. What someone wants for a pan isn't necessarily what somebody actually paid. Real value depends on the specific piece and what buyers are willing to pay. That's why research matters. And if you believe you've found something genuinely rare, getting an opinion from a knowledgeable collector or reputable antique dealer can be far better than relying on a random internet listing. But now we've reached number 2. And this one has one of the most important lessons of all. This is the pan people throw away. It's rusty. It's dirty. It may have years of soot on the bottom. The handle might be rough. Maybe it was sitting outside a barn underneath a pile of broken equipment. Nobody wants it, except someone who knows what they're looking at. Because collectors understand something most people don't. Condition and appearance aren't always the same thing. A rusty pan can sometimes be restored, but restoration must be approached carefully. Aggressive cleaning can remove original markings or alter the surface. And if the piece is genuinely rare, careless restoration could hurt its collectible appeal. So before you start attacking an old skillet with power tools, stop. Take photographs. Document the markings. Research the manufacturer. Compare the shape and characteristics with known examples. Then decide whether cleaning is appropriate. Because the goal isn't simply to make the pan look new. The goal is to understand what you actually have. And now we've reached number 1. Imagine you're cleaning an old American barn. You come across a rusty skillet. Nothing about it screams valuable. No shiny finish. No beautiful packaging. No fancy display case. Just an old piece of iron. You almost throw it away. Then you turn it over. And there it is. A manufacturer's marking. A distinctive casting feature. A size or shape that matches a known collectible variation. Suddenly, that rusty piece of iron isn't just an old pan anymore. It's a piece of history. And depending on the exact manufacturer, model, rarity, condition, authenticity, and collector demand, certain antique cast iron pieces can command hundreds or, in exceptional cases, thousands of dollars. But here's the biggest lesson from this entire list. The money isn't in the rust. The money is in knowing what you're looking at. That's why the next time you clean out an old barn, farmhouse, smokehouse, or storage shed, don't automatically throw every rusty skillet into the scrap pile. Turn it over. Look for markings. Check the shape. Study the handle. Look at the underside. Photograph everything. And research before you restore. Because that ugly old skillet sitting underneath a pile of forgotten farm equipment could be completely ordinary. Or it could be the one piece everyone else overlooked. And that's what makes old barns so fascinating. They don't just contain old things. Sometimes they contain forgotten stories. And occasionally, forgotten value. So the next time you see a rusty cast iron pan, don't ask, "Why would anyone keep this?" Ask, "What am I looking at?" Because you might be looking at something worth far more than it appears. And if you enjoyed this kind of forgotten farm treasure story, subscribe to the channel, because there are plenty more old objects sitting in American barns right now that most people would walk straight past without ever realizing what they were worth.